So welcome to our 8th Kretz public lecture. I'm Brad Schaefer. I'm the director of the UCLA Kretz Center for California Conservation Science. The Kretz Center is an academic center. We're basically a bunch of faculty, students, and a few staff. And our goal is, like any center at the university, is research, teaching, and outreach. But our main goal is research. That's what we do, and we do research that we use to promote important, meaningful conservation science in partnership with folks like our distinguished guests from the National Park Service, who we work with very, very closely. The different ways that we do research are pretty varied, but the big ones are we support young scholars, we support postdoctoral researchers, and we support graduate students in their efforts to do meaningful management-oriented science. And I moved down here 5 years ago to be the founding director of the Kretz Center, and in that time, I've been incredibly proud of the science that these young women and men have done. It's projects on mountain lion conservation in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's projects on drought resistance and the effects of drought and smog on our native plants. It's projects on using genomics to conserve amphibians and reptiles, something near and dear to my own personal heart as a researcher. It's monitoring butterfly populations in the Santa Monicas. It's using environmental DNA to monitor our oceans. It's a whole suite of different projects and things that we do. It's worked well, and I think really importantly, many of the folks who we've supported have gone on to get professional jobs in the business as university employees, university professors, government employees, working for non-government organizations, whatever it might be. And in that sense, we are hoping to, and I think succeeding, in building sort of a cadre of people who really care about conservation in California and want to make it their lifetime pursuit. We can support someone for a couple of years. They're going to work for the next 30 years. There's a fabulous, fabulous sort of, benefit in that equation. So I'm curious, how many of you, by any chance, made it to the March for Science yesterday down at downtown? Fantastic. I don't know about you. I was totally inspired by that march. I did not imagine anywhere near that number of people were going to show up. The streets were packed. You couldn't walk for a while. I thought it was inspirational, and I thought it was really amazing. And I think it demonstrated, at least to me, just how much people care about science, about how science influences human health, how it influences environmental health, and how important it is to us. And there is no place where that's more important than in the realm of conservation. It's what we're all about. Science motivates, generates, drives important conservation actions. And so that march was really important. So one of the things I do oftentimes when I introduce these lectures is I spend a couple of minutes and I talk about the accomplishments of the Kretz Center over the last year and what we're going to be doing next year. And we've had some great accomplishments, some great people. We're doing new buildings. But I thought about it, and in terms of a single action and a single thing that I want to see happen next year, in part because of the March for Science, what I decided is that my goal for next year is to double the number of postdocs and the number of graduate students who we can support through the Kretz Center. Thank you. And I think we can do that. It takes some money. It takes some help. We have certainly some of that funding in place, and we'll raise more. But I think it's the right goal for right now. One of the things that is crystal clear is that funding from the federal government for education and for research in environmental science, including conservation science, is at risk. It's going to be lower next year than it was this year, and it's going to be a pretty thin, limited resource for the next several years. And I think as citizens who care about the environment, who care about conservation, who care about research, one of the things we can do is try and make up that difference. And that's something that I really want to do next year and as long as we need to through the Kretz Center. And that brings me, interestingly enough, to today's program. So this year, as many of you may know, is the centennial year for our National Park Service. You know, the national parks are arguably, not arguably, they are the crown jewel of our protected lands in the United States. The Park Service has been around for 100 years, and they do some amazing work. And our speaker today is an amazing person. Dr. Ray Sauvajot, he'll stand up here in just a moment and talk to you. And Ray is, and I have to get this right, he's the Associate Director for Natural Resource Stewardship and Science with the U.S. National Park Service. Now, what that means in plain English is that Ray's in charge of science nationally for the National Park Service. There's something like 750 scientists employed by the Park Service. Ray is their boss. Ray sets their policy. Ray sets their agenda. And if right now isn't an important time for a person like Ray, no time is, because this is when, you know, you got to make hard decisions and you've got to make the right decisions. In terms of his history, although Ray lives in DC, he did most of his important training right here in California. He was an undergrad in biology at UC San Diego. He got his PhD in the ecology graduate group at UC Davis. And then for the first decade of his career, he moved down here to the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, where, again, I need to get the title right. He was an ecologist, senior science advisor, and chief of planning, science, and resource management here in the Santa Monicas. Again, an important leadership position. Ray hired a number of great people, some of whom are in this room, and had helped make science an important agenda item at the Santa Monica Mountains. He then moved up north to the Bay Area, and for 5 years was the Pacific West Region Natural Resource Program Chief, which means he oversaw sort of science and resource management in the parks on the West Coast. Then he moved in 2014 to DC to take over that leadership position for the entire country. Ray was, or has been, an adjunct faculty member at UCLA, at CSUN, Cal State Northridge, and at Berkeley, and he's really made some incredible, important, actions in sort of the bridge between science and policy, between universities and applied managers. And so it's going to be great to hear what he has to say. Before I turn it over to him, there's a few people in the audience who I would like to thank, who helped me make this event happen and who helped me with everything that I do. The first of those, and first and foremost, is I'd like to thank Mario Colon. Many of you may know Mario. He's been my administrative assistant at the Kretz Center since I moved down here 5 years ago. He's been with me virtually that whole time. He's helped me organize all these lectures and everything else that I do. And sadly, this is going to be Mario's last lecture that he helps me with. Not because he's sick of me, although he may well be, but because he's moving on to, of course, get a higher degree at UC Santa Barbara in environmental management and sustainability. He'll be starting that program in the fall, and I'll miss him terribly. I also like to thank Gary Bucciarelli, another close colleague of mine at UCLA, who helps me with everything that I do in the Kretz Center, including this lecture. Here at Pepperdine, who we partner with on this lecture, Augustine Vargas and Lee Katz are my colleagues, collaborators, partners in crime on making all of this happen. Without them, we wouldn't have this gorgeous venue. We wouldn't have these spectacular flowers. We wouldn't have the cookies. I thank them. And last, and absolutely not least, I'd like to thank Morton Kretz. Mort is a philanthropist, an environmentalist, and a good friend. And Mort and his daughter, Linda Duttenhaver, have been generous beyond all means. They've helped fund and start the Kretz Center. They've been generous to the University of California Natural Reserve System. They're wonderful, wonderful partners. And I'd like to thank all those people, so please join me. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ray, Dr. Sauvajot.
Thank you. Does the mic turn on? Yes, it does. Cool. I didn't want to have a hot mic on while I was sitting over there. We know those can lead to bad things. So, very, very nice to be here. Thank you for coming, and thank you all for working to get me out here. I'm very, very pleased. Lots of familiar faces, but really what has been telling and in some ways comforting and inspirational at the same time is the landscape, the Santa Monica Mountains, and seeing all these familiar places and the beautiful mountains after I know you guys have been waiting for a wet year for a while, and so it came. And it shows out there. So it's great to be back, and I thank the Kretz Center for supporting this program, but for all the work that goes on here as well. So what I want to do is step back a bit from what we sort of introduced this with in talking about the science and its importance, and think about science in the very broadest sense for national parks all across the national park system, and talk a bit about what sorts of key issues are important, that science is going to be necessary for helping the national park system move forward in a time of unprecedented change, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And so specifically, I want to first set the context and try to put people sort of in the shoes of those that are actually managing parks on the ground, and particularly those that are the resource managers and the scientists in parks, and talk about the various challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to try to organize those challenges in a series of pillars that help us understand the diversity of actions that we need to be taking for science and from science to help achieve the mission of the National Park Service. And then I want to talk specifically about how across the National Park System we're working to put those pillars to work. What are some of the specific actions and specific priorities that are underway that are going to be helpful for us to manage national parks into the future in the context of these challenges that we face, and then also talk about the role and importance of science in informing that work. And then finally, I'm going to conclude by talking about how none of this work is going to be successful without collaboration, without many players participating, contributing to conservation stewardship actions on the ground, but also contributing to the scientific knowledge that we need to have to protect our national parks for current and future generations. So let's start by setting the context. So you're a resource manager in a park. You're responsible for some place on the ground. It's a very significant place on the ground. Many people come and visit it. And you have a lot of things that affect you every single day that you have to attend to. And among those, and perhaps chief among those, are invasive species. And so this is something that national park managers all across the country and every one of our park units have to contend with. And the National Park Service spends an enormous amount of money every year to attempt to manage, control, in some cases attempt to eradicate invasive species. This includes plants, it includes animals, and they have important and significant impacts on national park resources all around the country. In addition to that, in our national parks, every day when you come to work as a resource manager, as a scientist, as a park manager, you're always struggling with this challenge of balancing resource preservation with visitor use and access. The national parks have a mission to protect resources, but they also have a mission to ensure that those resources are available for public enjoyment. And so how do you make that work? We just got off 2016, another record year of visitation in the national park system. Over 330 million people came to national parks in 2016. In the last few years, we continue to set that record. What is appropriate? What are the effects of these kinds of activities, and what needs to be done right here, right now, on the ground, in the park that you are working in? In addition to those day-to-day challenges, many parks have iconic species. They have sensitive species. Sometimes they're the same. You'll have an iconic species that's also sensitive. I'll point to bison as one of these unusual, big, scruffy animals that many people enjoy seeing, but they're big and they're lumbering, and they leave the park rather frequently, at least in Yellowstone. And so it is not, I'm sure, if you're working in Yellowstone National Park and not a day goes by where you're not thinking about management of that species and its effects on the resources in the park and the numbers of animals that are in the park and what those animals are doing when they leave the park. So this is a day-to-day challenge. You are barraged with these kinds of questions. And it's true for sensitive species like the desert bighorn sheep and the desert tortoise, and for the nesting grounds of sea turtles that occur on the beaches that are visited by millions of people every year. And it's not just animals, it's plants as well. Parks that are named after plants like Joshua Tree National Park and Redwood National and State Parks, where you are responsible for ensuring that these values persist, even when these values do things that are sometimes unexpected and troublesome in the case of bison lumbering across park boundaries. In addition, park managers are often faced with protecting resources that have experienced damage in the past. And it's our responsibility to ensure that those values are maintained over time and that they are restored to natural conditions as much as possible. And that means we invest a lot of effort and time in restoration. Sometimes it's restoration of the activities that are occurring because of people coming to visit parks or because of the actions that we may take in order to facilitate visitation. In other cases, it's past disturbance that has occurred. For example, in the Channel Islands, huge amounts of effort have gone forward in restoring the Channel Islands after intensive, invasive, and exotic species have been there for many years. So restoring damaged habitats and ecosystems, another thing to think about as you manage national parks on a day-to-day basis. And I put up a couple of images there of marine environments as well, because I think we all know that the marine environments, while they can often be sort of out of the minds of folks that are standing on the mainlands looking in, under the surface, there have been tremendous changes that have been influenced by human activities that the National Park Service is working to try to address as well. Okay, so those are the day-to-day things. The simple things, right? You come into work and you have invasive species, and you've got restoration projects, and you've got all these things that are affecting you when somebody calls and says, we got all these visitors in the wilderness areas and they're trampling the riparian area. Tend to those, but don't forget that there are all kinds of environmental changes occurring on top of that. Chief among them, of course, climate change. So think about climate change too. Climate change, I'll point to these two maps on the left there. The top one is an analysis of mean temperatures in national park units. And I'm not going to go into any details except to say that in general, without exception, there's a few exceptions here and there, but they're very, very minor. National parks are a sort of they're a biased sample of places that have experienced greater than expected temperature increases relative to areas around them. And all of those, of course, are showing signatures of increasing temperature and climate change. The bottom picture is the same analysis, but this was with precipitation. The kind of take-home message there was some places have seen a lot more, some places have seen a lot less, but what is true in all cases is increased variability, which has led to lots of additional unpredictability layered on top of the temperature changes. And so this leads to things that we see now, we observe now. So we see onsets of spring occurring sooner in national parks. We see rain on snow events like in the Pacific Northwest that we weren't seeing before that create all kinds of challenges and issues for managing national park resources. We see wildfires in western forests whose signatures are associated with prolonged drought linked to a changing climate. We see mountain pine beetle outbreaks, for example, in Rocky Mountain National Park and in western forests all across the US, where huge areas of trees are now dead from a native species, but a native species whose presence and abundance appears associated with the changing climate such that the overwintering temperatures, now higher, allow larger populations of this animal to persist, allow it to move over the continental divide, and to create outbreaks that are just absolutely unprecedented. This is changing huge, huge areas of western forests. Closer to home, in an interesting study that has been underway for some time. So way back near the turn of the century, Joseph Grinnell and his colleagues looked at the distribution of a number of different kinds of vertebrates, small mammals, birds, reptiles, and they took detailed observations about where these animals occurred and provided an amazing data set that has allowed people now to go back and take a look again and ask the question, are these species occurring where they did at that time? Well, interestingly and perhaps not surprisingly, they're there, but they're in different places. And the data indicates that the shifts, the changes in where these animals occur are shifting in ways that are consistent with a warming climate. And so animals like the alpine chipmunk in Yosemite National Park has shifted upslope to higher elevations, and we see this with many other species. I won't go into the details of the graphs. I just put them on there to convince you that this is real science. For all my university colleagues. I don't do science anymore, but I show graphs. Climate change, okay, environmental change, but there are a lot of other kinds of changes. Again, think of yourself sitting in a park, having to deal with the day-to-day work, and remember we talked about the invasive species problem and lots of visitors, and oh yeah, climate change, but the people that are coming to the park are changing as well. Huge changes and shifts in economic and social conditions and cultural perspectives about how people recreate in parks, what they expect when they get there. These are all factors that are affecting how we manage resources in parks and how we need to manage resources in parks. I think many of us would agree that many of the challenges that we face in parks are in fact people challenges, even though they're manifested as resource challenges on the ground. Okay, so that is all easy. You know, you deal with your invasive species and you think about balancing visitor access, and you don't forget about climate change and that all the people coming to the park have different perspectives. And on top of all that, all the resources that you're responsible for managing don't stay in your park. They're moving all over the place. And so all the things on the top line up there, all those different animals, they may exist in parks, but many of them spend only a fraction of their life histories within particular park units. And it's not just species, it's also the ecosystem processes and the authenticity of the experiences that you have when you're in a national park that depend on the context of that national park. And so as a park manager, you have to be constantly aware that what is going on in your park is inextricably linked to what's going on outside of your park and all around you. Caribou migrations across the Arctic coastal plain. You can put a park up there, but that park will not have caribou if you are not thinking about the broader context of these animals and the large distances they move across this broad area. Oh, and did I mention climate change? Elk migrations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So you go to Yellowstone and you see elk everywhere, right? They're just a species that's there. Well, it turns out that they're there, but they're all around as well. And so this is an indication of different elk herds. And you can see that these animals make great movements in and out of the park at different times of the year, sometimes taking advantage of very narrow pathways in their movements in and out of Yellowstone National Park. And so these species that we think are just so ubiquitous in the park are actually depending on an ecosystem much broader than the millions of acres of Yellowstone National Park. This was highlighted in an issue last year of National Geographic, and there's some really compelling photos and video material on their website about these particular species. And it's not confined to terrestrial systems, marine systems. The more we look at marine systems, the more we realize how interconnected they are and how widely dispersed and how incredibly complex the movements are across big, broad areas. So protecting sea turtle nests in Gulf Islands National Seashore is all fine and good, but if you're not worrying about where those sea turtles go for the big chunk of their life history, that effort may be for naught. So you need to be thinking at this broad scale. Successful resource stewardship then depends on collaborative conservation, because the resources and the processes that we're responsible for protecting and understanding and ensuring are available for people to enjoy in the future occur at a much broader scale than the individual units that are assigned to us to protect. And it's not just the processes and the species, but it's the challenges that they face. So there's two images up here. The bigger map is the solar and renewable energy planning effort that was underway a few years ago looking at the entire West. And you can see that if you're not thinking about how parks fit into that complex picture of where areas might be available for different kinds of solar energy development, you will potentially lose the opportunity to ensure that the broad-scale movements necessary for your resources could be lost. The image on the right there is the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan here in the California desert. Same idea. The scale with which decisions are being made are very broad, as the resource values and their movements and their dependence are also very broad. And I had to put a picture of, or a map of the Santa Monica Mountains up there in the right. That picture is not unlike pictures everywhere in the world where the mosaic of different jurisdictions and landowners and managers must work together because these systems are broad. The sort of pinkish orange cloud in the middle image there is the distribution of grizzlies moving up and down between Canada and the US at the crown of the continent with Glacier National Park in the middle. Those species, those animals occur over a broad area. The green areas are the protected areas within there. So it's a complex picture that requires us to be working with many different people at very broad scales. Okay, so that's easy, right? So you come into work, and this is what you got to deal with. How do we make sense of this? And so I'm going to present you a little bit of an attempt that we've been working on to try to articulate the complexity with which these challenges exist and to organize, in a sense, to provide a framework for the diversity of investments that are necessary for science and resource stewardship in national parks. And so there are 4 pillars that we use to organize these ideas, and I'm going to talk about them in turn. The first is this idea of holding the line. Protecting and maintaining and restoring biodiversity and ecosystem integrity at park units, the day-to-day work that you have to attend to, the management of invasive species, the dealing with the visitation issues and the trampling that may occur in a particular spot, the restoration that's necessary. But in addition to that, thinking about managing amid continuous change. And so not forgetting about the investments that are necessary to understand and respond to environmental change, including climate change, resolving stressors that impact ecosystem integrity and resilience. Often these will interact, invasive species interact with the resilience of an ecosystem to maintain its integrity amid continuous change, amid climate change. And then I mentioned before social science, so thinking about how park visitors and different stakeholders interact with resources, use that knowledge to improve resource conditions and visitor experiences and resource stewardship. So managing amid continuous change. A third pillar, leveraging our efforts at the broad scale. So leveraging for conservation at scale, promoting science and stewardship and collaborative conservation at broad scales. I hope I convinced you that that's critical if we want these values to persist over time. And that, of course, means establishing and enhancing partnerships and relationships with many different types of groups and organizations, scientific as well as managerial and stewardship groups. And then the last pillar here is more about ensuring that the work that we do as resource managers and as scientists is available to actually affect decisions on the ground. That we have the tools and that we communicate scientific information and that we make sure that the people that are doing the work in national parks have the information and the training and the support that's necessary to make that science actionable, and that we communicate that with the public as well. And so stewardship and science access and engagement is about engaging broadly with the public, but it's also about ensuring that we, as an agency and as a group of people responsible for managing parks, have the right information at the right time to make a difference on the ground. So in the National Park Service, we invest a lot in things that help right here and now in parks. I talked about invasive species, park-specific impacts, day-to-day investments that we have to attend to. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of things that are important for the system broadly, overall. And so this is an investment matrix that I push people and say, we need to be thinking about things that help you day-to-day in parks, but also ensure that the system of national parks and the conservation lands we have will be available for the future. And so there's this balance between attending to those hold-the-line activities while at the same time thinking about how we can invest our limited resources in science and resource stewardship to have the greatest impact in the greatest number of places across our conservation lands. So ideally, we want to spend our time investing there. I'm just going to quickly mention that what I'm talking about is consistent with the broader policies that the National Park Service has in place. Last year, Director's Order 100, a policy Director's Order, was issued conveniently on the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service that talks about managing in the face of change and enhancing our engagement at landscape and seascape levels and committing to science to inform decisions. But I want to point out that it talks about the importance of using the best available science, but recognizing that the national parks are responsive to the American public and that there are laws and policies that drive the decisions that we actually make. So science informs those decisions, but they are also influenced by law and long-term public interest. And so it's this sort of three sort of pillars that one needs to think about. So I won't talk a lot more about Director's Order 100 now, except to tell you that these things, the things I just talked about, are included in the policies that we try to implement in the Park Service. And one of the roles that I'm trying to play is to use this framework to try to indicate the complexity of the challenges that we have to address, but to convince that the investments are critical in order for us to meet the mission of the National Park Service. So what are we doing? In this holding the line area, we are working, and folks that work for the Park Service out here, this will be coming soon. Resource stewardship strategies. I want to be able to tell with confidence people in Washington, D.C. and other places that Every single park in the national park system knows what they're doing and why they're doing it with respect to science and resource management. And we're hopeful that resource stewardship strategies can help us do this. Many parks do this work already, but to be able to confidently say that we know where we're at, where we want to be, and what are the important things we need to do to get there, and to do this in an integrated way with cultural resources and natural resources and park planning working together is an effort now we have launched and we have underway. Investing in social science and resource stewardship, understanding that these are absolutely linked. We need to understand the socioeconomic and cultural changes that are occurring among the people visiting parks so that we can better preserve resources and so that we can also better ensure that the experiences that people have when they come to parks are the experiences that they expect and that are responsive to the values in the national parks themselves. And so investing in this kind of work. In addition to understanding visitors themselves, looking at how national parks and conservation lands contribute to the broader economic values of our nation, and not just economic values from the sense of, people spending money and coming to parks, but also the values, the sometimes intangible values that economic science allows us, provides techniques for quantifying. And so we know that there are visitor spending influences of national parks that exceed $35 billion all across the country for national parks. Results just came out last week. But in addition to that, the total economic value that include some of these non-tangible values are closer to $90 billion. So we want to make sure we understand these things. It's important to understand these things. The National Park Service has invested a lot in understanding resources and doing good science. We need to keep doing this, and I'm going to point out specifically continued focus and investment in the inventory and monitoring program that we have. All the national parks are part of networks. Within those networks across the country, they work and share resources and expertise to monitor the condition of what we call vital signs of ecosystem condition. This work is critical. It has helped advance the importance of objective and credible science in the Park Service. We need to continue to do this work. Climate change response. The National Park Service has had for a number of years now a climate change response strategy that has 4 important goals: ensuring that parks provide venues for doing science to understand climate change, making sure that our own activities are helping to be more energy efficient, so mitigation, communicating the role and effects of a changing climate on the experiences and the values in national parks, and then probably the toughest is, what do we do about it? What are the things that might be appropriate to respond to because of a changing climate? So that adaptation box is the biggest challenge. But we need to keep doing this work, and we are. And there are examples across parks where this work is underway. Embrace collaborative conservation at broad scales. Landscape and seascape scales. Again, I talked a lot about this earlier. It's important for the resources that we're to protect. It's important for the processes that drive those values. And it's important not just for natural resources, but for cultural resources as well. The image up in the right-hand corner there are fishing ponds, ancient fishing ponds on Hawaiian Islands, where the context within which these cultural resources exist are critical for people understanding when they visit these sites. And the context that is broader than that individual park unit is important to understand as well. Some things that are underway right now in the national park system is to work to ensure that park managers really embrace this concept, that to not see the park as the place that you need to sort of hunker down in, but you need to work much more broadly. So we are providing tools to park managers through the Scaling Up Toolkit, so that people in the national park system can share ideas and share examples of ways that they have scaled up, working collaboratively with others around their park units. and working with partners outside the National Park Service, like with the Practitioners Network for Large Landscape Conservation, ensuring that the tools and the mechanisms and the resources available to park managers are accessible so that they can do this work that's so important. And it occurs at international scales as well. Last year, working with colleagues in Canada and Mexico, we developed an analysis of conservation accomplishment. And the bottom line answer to the question, what have we accomplished with conservation, points to the importance of national parks, but also to the importance of the many other managed lands that occur in and around national parks. And so depending on how you sort of mix and match those areas, the answer to the question of have we accomplished conservation successfully depends on how all of that part of the conservation portfolio is considered. For science and resource management to continue to make a difference and continue to be embraced and continue to be supported, we need to engage the public in this. And citizen science and biodiversity discovery are outstanding tools and ways that we are doing this through investing in getting people involved in doing all the things that I mentioned to you. And I had to put up the poster of the Santa Monica Mountains Bio Blitz with my son wearing the backpack. He's a little older now. But this stuff is important. It's important because it helps raise awareness of the resources in parks and the challenges that they face, but it also provides opportunities for people to actually get involved in helping the National Park Service understand resources and affect stewardship in parks on the ground, because we don't have sufficient resources to do it ourselves. Finally, I want to emphasize that none of this is going to work, none of this can succeed without ensuring that the scientists and the resource managers in our national parks have the support that they need to do their jobs and do their work. And so in those various pillars, the 4 pillars I talked about, that last one that talks about science access also includes ensuring that our scientists have the tools that they need to do the work that's so important to ensure that resources are protected for current and future generations in our national parks. We can't lose sight of that through this effort. All of this will not succeed without collaborative approaches. Collaborative approaches for doing conservation, so the actions that we need to take on the ground to ensure that the values in national parks are protected. So working with other agencies, with other organizations, with state and local governments, with private landowners. And I just put a couple of examples. The Appalachian Trail is over 2,000 miles long. The vision of that resource, the value of that entire unit depends on the relationships that have to be developed with the many different jurisdictions and landowners across its entire length. The Crown Managers Partnership up at Glacier National Park that includes Canada and the United States and then many, many other agencies and organizations. And I don't want to even mention the place here, the Santa Monica Mountains. And we need to do the science that's necessary to inform the decisions that are necessary around resource stewardship. And the National Park Service by itself cannot do that work. And so we need to have collaboration and engagement with partnerships that involve universities and institutions and science agencies and the public through citizen science. And you'll notice the Kretz Center for California Conservation Science. I'm not sure if that's the most up-to-date version, but I did my best. So this is critical. All of the work that I mentioned to you depends on the relationships that are developed with others and working together to accomplish these things, so that ultimately we are in a place where we can look at the national parks and the national park system primed to succeed in a dynamic future. Things are going to be changing. All these complexities are draped over the day-to-day challenges. But we need to be ready and prepared for those things. And science is going to depend, or science is going to be critical in us doing that work. But the science and stewardship that we do is advanced with clarity of purpose and through collaboration. We know what we're doing and we know why we're doing it. And I'm hopeful that the sort of framework that I laid out provides some of that clarity. And then ultimately, the success of the work that is done is demonstrated by the innovation we see in park-specific actions, by positioning the national parks and the National Park Service for the future, for a complex, uncertain future, but one that will depend on good scientific information, and then support and appreciation from partners, from stakeholders in the public, because we're doing good work and we're serving in the public interest to preserve and protect national park values for them and for their children and for their children's children. And I think I will conclude there, and hopefully that was...
And I thank you. Okay, next phase of this program is going to be, before we get any questions for Ray, is I'd like to introduce another really, really important person, and that's David Szymanski. David, over there on the side. David is the superintendent of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. And sort of in case you don't know how national parks work, I mean, that means David's the big boss. He's the guy who sort of runs everything in our local national park, the largest urban national park in the country. And it's incredible to have Ray at the national level and David at the more local level here joining us. And so what I'd like is for both of them to sit down in two of these chairs, and one in the middle and one on a side. And what I'd like to do is sort of take this opportunity to ask them. What I'm going to do is just start out by, I've got 3 prompts, 3 questions. They've seen at least some version of these in the past. And I'm going to ask them a couple of questions just to kind of get things started. And then we'll have the most fun part of this evening or late afternoon, which is Q&A from you guys. And before we start that, let me ask my questions, but then just remember, these are 2 of the most important, influential people in the National Park Service in our world, locally and nationally. And so think about questions you want to ask them. I've asked them. They said any questions are just fine. Give them your most interesting and hardest questions, because I'm going to be really, really curious to see what they have to say. So, but let's get started. So first question for you guys. Yesterday, at least those of us who were at the march, saw a huge call for the importance of science in our lives, including in our national parks. And I was just wondering, just to kind of get the creative juices flowing, if you could give us an example of science being done in your jurisdiction that actually influences how national parks are managed, and what additional science you think would most benefit the National Park Service. And I asked them to speak for like a minute, so they're not going to give you a lot of detail on this. And I don't know, David, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Am I on? There we go. When Brad said there was someone important here, I was expecting Governor Jerry Brown or somebody else to come. But, so thanks for the very kind, but probably overinflated introduction. That is an excellent question. Obviously, since we're here at this talk, to say no wouldn't be
right.
a good way to begin. But I'm actually going to step back a little bit further. You know, national parks are also unique in the sense that each one of them requires an act of Congress to be created. So they're very much a creation of the community where they're located. And I think the Santa Monica Mountains are a place where that is true more so maybe even than a lot of other places. And this gets at why science is so important. You know, our enabling legislation recognized that the state of California and its subdivisions, i.e. the cities and counties, could and would do a tremendous amount of the conservation work. So when we were invited to, in a sense, join the join the efforts in the mountains, it was really to see what we could do to provide something else that maybe wasn't there. And one of the things that that people hit on, and I'm very fortunate to sit next to Ray. So Ray essentially put together our science program starting 2 decades ago. And being a manager and having 20 years of science available to you when you enter into a position is pretty important. But I think my point is that I'm not the only one who uses the science. I think one of the most useful things, and I'll give you has been how local governments have used that science. Mm-hmm. And predominantly, I think the biggest threat, and Seth Riley is sitting right in the audience so he can disagree, the biggest threat facing us here in Southern California, because all of our fates are tied up with Southern California, is habitat fragmentation. It's preserving enough of the whole so that things are connected, so that animals can move back and forth, so that there are open spaces for plants and other things to move in, so that we maintain enough patches to keep the whole healthy. And here, I think working with the Kretz Center, to be honest, if we had to say our program and our work together has a focus, it's primarily that. I think it's everything from the work that Seth and the folks that work for him have done on not only mountain lions, but everything from wren tits to fence lizards that show that there are impacts. And in a lot of cases, these populations are being separated from themselves through habitat fragmentation. To be honest, that's spurred much more action among the public and local governments, both in investments of funding and decisions, than it probably has in terms of National Park Service action.
Okay. And by the way, several of those projects are Kretz National Park Service collaborations, and I didn't pay David to say that. So, Ray, science.
So I'm gonna, since I was speaking in grander terms before, I'm gonna focus straight on down and just point out some specific examples. Everglades National Park, a huge amount of effort underway now to ensure that the system that is the Everglades continues as an ecosystem. That would not have happened without the scientific knowledge to understand the hydrology and the complex relationships. If you look at Florida, it is just an enormous amount of water that just slowly flows to the south and then into the ocean. And that is critical for the functioning of that ecosystem. Draining all kinds of things around it and reclaiming all kinds of stuff and building huge cities on top of swamps was a huge challenge for that ecosystem. Bringing that back has depended on an understanding of the hydrology of that system so that that water flow can return so that the system can persist. So that depended on scientific information. I'll give you another example, actually 2 examples. I'm going to bring it more local. So when I worked here, if somebody had told me when I started, and some of you may have heard this story before, that years ago when we were talking about the importance of connectivity and the challenges that David just talked about around fragmentation, if you could walk into the offices of the Caltrans environmental section in downtown Los Angeles and see sitting on their wall a map of mountain lion movement corridors in Southern California, I would have said, you're crazy. That has happened. That is science. That is science that's making a difference here on the ground. And then my next last example is Channel Islands National Park. The realization of how we have for so long been able to kind of keep out of sight and out of mind marine ecosystems, the awareness of the challenges that marine ecosystems are facing was hugely benefited from the science that was done and is continuing to be done at Channel Islands National Park to monitor the status and trends of the ecosystem there so that the establishment of marine protected areas, which, not too long ago was, no one ever thought, marine protected areas, why do we need those? It's this never-ending abundant resource. Science showed us that it is not a never-ending abundant resource, that it requires care. And scientific information in a national park has helped make that happen.
Okay, thank you. My second prompt, my second question, every kid in a park was an Obama-era initiative aimed at engaging our kids, our children, in the National Park Service. And I'd like to know, at the national level and at the local level, do you think that initiative is working? And what can we as members of the public do to increase that engagement, to get more kids into our parks? Or do we need to?
I guess I'll go first. Ray didn't say Caltrans actually paid for a lot of the research too, which is even
but this
it's
was
different
even
that
before.
Before the Ray must have buttered them up well. Absolutely. The payoff, I think it's similar to long-term monitoring. We're not going to know for a couple decades. These public places belong to all of us, and if one of the things as a public lands manager, if everyone doesn't have access, you end the day perhaps feeling good about your job, but not entirely good about your job. So the great thing about every kid in the park, and it's being continued by our philanthropic partner, the National Park Foundation, is it does give all kids, and specifically kids that we're focusing on in Los Angeles and Ventura County that may not have the chance to get out into a park. We've been heavily, this effort for folks, it's been heavily supported philanthropically. So all of the bus trips have been paid for by donated dollars. And in 2016, they allowed us to bring 14,000 kids in. This year, we'll bring 18,000 kids, and next year, 25,000 kids to experience their parks. And who knows? I mean, I hope they are smitten and bitten by the bug, and they want to come back because they're going to be. Who knows which one of them is going to be a leader in their community? They are the future constituents and caretakers. So I think this is one of the most important things we do.
They're also the future voters. So, right.
I'm going to offer two comments a little bit different. First is, I have to disclose that I have a fourth grader. And this affected me directly not too long ago when I was going with some of my neighbors, and we were actually going to go out. You can't sort of turn a stone in Washington, D.C. without some National Park Service presence. Every single park there is managed by the National Park Service, and some of them have entrance fees. And so I was about to go on a hike with my neighbors, and I realized that there's no way I can get into this park free if I don't bring my daughter along, because at the little entrance gate, they say, "Where's your fourth grader?" If you hand them the little pass, that says, so we've got one, but she's got to be in the car, so I get to drag her around everywhere. A few weeks ago, I was actually at a conference in Canada, and there were people there from the health department from Canada, and they started to lay out all the various health challenges that we collectively in our society experience. And the Canadian ones were very similar to what we see in this country, so obesity and diabetes and lots and lots of ailments and challenges, both physical as well as psychological, associated with sedentary indoor activity or lack of activity. And the way this was laid out, it was unbelievably, sort of eye-opening and insightful when you listed all of the challenges and the risks that one could find by experiencing outdoor activities. Whether it's falling down and scraping your knee, or falling out of a tree because you're climbing a tree. All of these things absolutely paled in comparison to all of the health challenges that we experience because of a environment that has us so fixed on being inside, and simple things like instead of walking to school, you get driven to school. And what better antidote to these challenges than to just open the doors and say, get out, experience nature, go to parks, and to start with youth. that, I think, is critical, and I think it is, I know in the Park Service we talk a lot about the sort of relationship between visiting parks and health value. I think that there's an even more untapped potential there, that this is a way, by ensuring and getting our youth outside as much as possible and using parks as a vehicle for doing that is a really, really great solution.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that it really resonates with last year in this room at this time, Heather Tallis from the Nature Conservancy spoke to us about sort of the value of nature and the fact that school kids' test scores go up if they just look at nature, and they go up more if they experience nature. So it's spot on with exactly what you're both saying. Okay, my final prompt before I turn it over to you guys is the closest I'm going to get to asking about sort of policy and administration. And it's the following. The Endangered Species Act, something near and dear to my heart again, is often cited as one of the most powerful pieces of species legislation and protection in the world. And I would ask, given that the national parks are some of our most protected areas, I'm just curious, is the Endangered Species Act important for the National Park Service, given that the parks protect the land and the species on them already? And do you think it's an important piece of legislation that we need to protect? Let's start with Ray.
So I'll caveat by saying that the law itself, although we, the National Park Service, don't formally implement the law, we are responsible for ensuring that endangered species are protected consistent with the law. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, of course, develops all the regulations, and they decide what can and can't be done in order to ensure recovery of endangered species. That said, the fact that law exists has an enormous influence on the actions that we take in the national park system. The directions that we go in terms of development or resource or visitor access, it drives really important restoration decisions, investments like in the island fox, Channel Islands fox, bringing wolves back to Yellowstone National Park, was in part an effort to help ensure the recovery of imperiled species. And so we look at the Endangered Species Act and the opportunities that national parks have to help recover endangered species. We also look at it as influencing our own policies such that the actions that we may be taking, whether it's developing campgrounds or other kinds of visitor facilities, that rare, threatened, and endangered species they receive a huge amount of attention, and that is included in the policies of how the National Park Service operates, but those policies are a direct result of the Act and what the Act says that we should be, valuing.
So it's important.
Did I say that?
Well, my wife served as a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist for 8 years, administering the Endangered Species Act, but she never had to administer it to me. I think locally, there are a couple things that are important. As Ray noted, we do need to comply with it, but I think we're fortunate to be often in the position of being able to do something very positive. I'd give you one example. Is Mr. Russell Gallipo, Superintendent at Channel Islands, who's sitting in the back, and the restoration of the island fox, which Ray noted. It can bring resources and focus to a lot of places. One of the funnest things to do at my previous park was to do estuary restoration. And I guarantee that the focus was there because there were limited endangered subspecies of salmonids, including cutthroat trout, that used the estuary. The restoration was wonderful for a whole variety of reasons. It brought back the historical landscape But we wouldn't have even been talking if there wasn't really that focus and the requirement that collectively the governments, including the federal government, needed to do something about the impact of the dams upstream. I think locally, one of the great things we've seen happen is the red-legged frogs breeding again in the Santa Monica Mountains. So I'd like to think everyone would still be excited, even if they weren't in a threatened species, and we just brought them back to the Santa Monica Mountains. But yeah, focuses attention on things that matter.
Okay, thanks. And the red-legged frog story, if you guys don't know it, it's amazing. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. Okay, there's my questions for these guys. It's time for you guys to ask questions. And do we want to get microphones around? Yeah, I think we've got some. So somebody a hand. Let's see. Somebody close to, yep, Sarah, give somebody a microphone. Let's go. Let's move them around.
Thank you. Appreciated the presentation, and these are always good ways of updating things in your valuable resource. I had a couple of questions. I wanted to know how the visitors are different, how millennials are different. Didn't ever have to talk me into going outside when I was a kid. Probably that's the way for a bunch of other people. The second question I'd like to ask is, what's your plan B if people who are decision makers don't really have the same attachment to science as you do, and they decide that economic value surpasses science?
Okay, now I don't know how we're going to do this. I think we should, whichever one of you want to take it, take it.
I'm gonna give a little bit of a different twist on an answer to the second question. So I have the privilege of overseeing a small team of people who, they're economists, but they're scientists. And the work that they do is demonstrating the economic value of these protected places, these conserved places, and they're using scientific techniques. And so it's almost like turning it on its head, right? And so we're going to use science to demonstrate that the economic value of these places are critical. And over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been able to really pump out some important findings around that. Findings that I will point out were highlighted just last week by the current Secretary of the Interior about the economic value of national parks that those numbers depended on good science, and those values, in order for them to persist, we will need other kinds of science to ensure that those values, those broader economic values, remain. And so yes, I think that at the end of the day, the decisions that are made, they are public decisions, right, about how things get managed and the balance between, who uses what and how and where. But to make those decisions most informed requires knowledge and information about the causes and consequences, and that depends on good science. And so my response, and I've actually had these specific conversations, is that it is my responsibility to the American public to make sure that we and they have the best information to make the most effective decisions about how we understand and protect our resources, this greater public good. It is a responsibility to do good science, because it is a responsibility to take care of these public trust resources properly.
And millennials, that's a good question. I'm not I've read some sociological data, and
now my son is a millennial, so
yeah, and I especially the coming from the skeptical from Gen Xers, folks born in the '60s that are very skeptical, they tend to see the light. The world a little bit rosier than we do. But I was going to say, my kids are younger. Our youngest son, to our horror, said, I'm a technology kid, Dad. I'm not an outdoor kid. And my wife and I looked at as though he had just, said he was going to give up his citizenship. And but you hope that I think what we see is people are increasingly urban, and it's more about giving people the chance to have that experience that a lot of us had, either with friends or with family or with a camp experience or a trip, just to make sure that it happens, because it seems harder now. It seems like even when even not too long ago in the kids, it seemed like when I was a kid in the '70s, your parents didn't really care. You went outside, where you went, how you roamed around, how you explored the natural world was pretty much unsupervised. And that's really not the case now. And I hate to say that as a parent, I'm probably part of the problem. But I think that's what we try to work on is, can we make sure they have the chance to dabble in it, and maybe it'll stick with them long enough.
Yeah, just get out and goof around. Okay, Sid, why don't you grab somebody over there?
This question is for Ray. Under the new administration, are resource extraction in national parks a factor, or is it changing?
So national parks are the management of national parks are driven by law. So there's an Organic Act that established the National Park Service, and how we manage parks is articulated in that law, and that law then trickles down into policy about how we manage parks. Each individual park unit has an enabling legislation about that particular park, and that is a law that is passed by Congress, and all of the park units still have to essentially abide by this umbrella Organic Act. And so any changes to how national parks are managed in the broad sense require legislative action, not administrative action. Now that said, there's a lot of nuances about how one interprets balancing visitor use and what kinds of activities are appropriate or not appropriate. But the National Park Service and the National Park System, I think, is unlike probably any other land management agency in the federal government. The Organic Act that established national parks is very clear about the importance of resource preservation. And so to turn that or to change that requires legislative action. We do have some unusual park units that when they were established, there were various kinds of uses that in order for the park to become established, certain activities were essentially grandfathered in, or they were allowed to continue. Even those activities have to abide by the Organic Act of the National Park Service, which says that you cannot have an activity in a national park that would impair the resources for current or future generations. Now, there's plenty of discussion, and I probably have them on not quite a daily basis, but sometimes about how one interprets this idea of impairment and what's impairment and what's not. But I will say that it is a fairly high bar under anyone's interpretation. Let me just mention, though, a couple of park units where there are some unusual circumstances. So when Mojave National Preserve was created, for example, grazing rights and grazing allotments continued in that park. Over time, many of those have been bought out. They've been purchased, and so there's less of that activity. But the activity itself, for it to continue in a national park unit, the National Park Service as an agency has the obligation, the responsibility to regulate that use within a national park to ensure that there would not be impairment. it doesn't mean that there are people that will come along and say, you, National Park Service, are allowing too much of this and allowing this kind of activity and it shouldn't occur. But because there is a law, what do you think people do when they disagree? Like the National Parks and Conservation Association, who is suing the National Park Service because of activities in Big Cypress National Preserve, or suing our friends at Channel Islands National Park a few years ago. So there is an avenue because of the law. So expect that there will always be this tug of how one interprets how far you can go, but a law exists, and it's my responsibility and all of those that work for the National Park Service as public servants to ensure that that law is upheld.
And David, I'd like to ask you as a follow-up on that. So, you're a guy who on the ground has to deal with that tug of war, and you're probably getting directives from, I would imagine, from DC, but you also have your own sort of freedom to make decisions. And I mean, how do you see that playing out? I mean, if somebody tells you to change your policy in the Santa Monica Mountains, do you have the ability to say, nope, I want to stick to what I'm doing, or do you have to listen to folks? How does that work?
You have to listen. Because it'd probably come from a memo from that.
Yeah, it would come as a memo from Ray. I spent a year working for the Senate Park Subcommittee in 2006 when so I was able to see a number of these issues play out at a park where I didn't work in D.C. and to see them. I mean, I would just say this is our system of checks and balances does work. I don't assume that defenders of parks are only one party. I definitely found that not to be true. Some of the Republicans on the Senate Park Subcommittee were some of the fiercest defenders of parks. These things belong to all of us. So the only thing I would say is, do we have the opportunity to say no? We follow, if you respect our Constitution and our democracy, as members of the administrative branch, unless a directive is illegal or unethical, we follow it. That's what we're paid to do. We're not paid to, if you could tell which party Ray or I vote after our presentation here today, we wouldn't be doing our jobs. However, I think what Ray noted, it's really not our job we provide the information, and for decisions that are at our discretion, we try to make the best ones we can. But we're not the only ones defending parks. The public is very, very involved, and I think parks are most popular when people sense that something may be threatening them.
Cool. Okay.
So
I guess
I got a microphone already, and I want to follow up and press you a little bit more on this question because just to take off from Ray, where you really set the context that we can't think about parks alone, that they're in this larger landscape context, the importance of collaborative conservation. So without trying to press either of you I'm going to see if I can finesse this question in a way that you might help us be able to understand the implications from your perspective. What are the things that you think we should be thinking about, studying, worrying about, vigilant about in that larger landscape context for parks, for national parks around the country, and particularly I think the Santa Monica Mountains are an interesting example where you can't think about the parks as just the parks alone. It's all kinds of lands being managed by all kinds of people. What are the in this period right now? What are the things that we should really be thinking about in that larger landscape context that could impair parks and that larger landscape?
I think one of the things that through my career and this has been, sort of a mantra of mine for a long time, this idea of connectivity and the importance of thinking about things at landscape scales, and doing the science that demonstrated those connections and that importance, but then trying to use that science to affect decisions on the ground. And what I would say is I do not get a sense that there is much dispute about the why question around that, why that is important. And in fact, the sort of Western wildlife heritage, the work with Western governors for a number of years have pointed out the importance of broad-scale connectivity, and that the things that help drive the economies of many states around wildlife heritage and ecosystem values, even though they may not be called that, there's wide recognition that the interrelationship is clear. And the science that helps us continue to point that out, I think, is going to be important. But I think it's well underway. I think it's happening in a lot of different places. So the question is less about why this is important and the fact that it exists, and it's more about how you then respond. How do you actually affect decisions on the ground? And there is concern about the National Park Service as an agency, sort of imposing its perspectives, its holier than thou conservation ethic on anyone and everyone around. And that's not just, that's true for private landowners, it's true for other agencies that we work with all the time, it's true for other organizations. That said, even though there are disputes and sometimes debates around that, there still is a nugget, I think, and more than a nugget, there is consistency of goals still embedded in there. So there is recognition that these values that are shared are important. The question then becomes, how do we ensure that those values, the values of national parks, the values of broader conservation and connectivity and wildlife, and those values that are shared, how do we ensure that they persist? So I think it's less of a if it's important and more of a how we do it. And in my time, I've seen lots of different paths taken on the how to do it. And I am certain that the how we do it path is going to look different, but the goal hasn't changed, if that makes sense.
David?
That's a good question, John. I'll take what I say will be consistent, but maybe a more local focus. I just wanted to return to our previous question and let people know I haven't received any directives from Washington yet. That doesn't mean they're not going to come, but the Park Service is extremely decentralized, and it's only when you have a controversial issue that people will want to weigh in. So
yeah, that's why I said David's the king of the park.
Yeah. So I would say, John, it's a really good question, and I'm going to lead into I think where the need is, and I think my fellow agencies and some of our elected officials would also agree. So right now it's a really exciting time to be in Southern California. At least I think so. Los Angeles just approved the largest parks measure in the country's history. We have Proposition 1 that really asks us to look at our water system, and here for Southern California, maybe to capture some of it and gain a little bit more water independence. In Ventura County, strangely enough, at a time when that area was very red, I would say now it's purple. You had 3 communities in Thousand Oaks, Simi Valley, and Santa Clarita that decided to protect open space, and Santa Clarita right now is very actively looking at those connections. I think the real question is we make these big investments is how do the mountains connect to the city and vice versa? In other words, in a sense, you can see the city, and when I say the city, anyone outside of Southern California assumes that Los Angeles extends all the way to the city of Ventura and goes. But the urban area, you can see it right now trying to recreate those things that it didn't have because it didn't spring from a center and go out. So it sounds to me, and I know you think much more deeply about these things, that it's recreating that transportation network that wasn't available. It's recreating those greenways and that park system. The thing that we're focusing on a little bit at the edges right now is how far can animals cross that concrete gulf and get to other protected areas? And that's one of the scientific questions, I think, for us. But I think the thing that's needed isn't necessarily is a group, and I hesitate to say this because, to be honest, I've rarely seen the kind of collaboration I've seen here in Southern California between the land management agencies and the county and the city. But I think what we have to ask us, and it is a struggle sometime because we're so focused on our day-to-day work, is how can we put all the pieces together, into a whole? We've seen how difficult that is around the LA River, or how expensive it can be, and if it's always going to be that expensive and that difficult, we can't do more than one of those. But I think there's a lot of smaller projects that will help connect people and communities to nature and also make those natural connections between the urban area and the sort of the large reservoirs of nature here in the mountains.
Okay, I would.
Hi, I would like to question concerning your use of pesticides in the parks. Recently, it's a well documented the problems with pesticide use in our environment. Recently, the city of Malibu has joined multiple communities across the nation and schools and cities across the nation that has recently adopted a pesticide-free policy where they look to using integrated pest management as the methodology of controlling weeds or invasive type species. Could you please tell me where the Parks Department policy is going towards? I know that your policy does deem that you do use integrated pest management. We're hoping that as communities across the nation have rejected chemical pesticides such as glyphosate to control pesticides that are extremely questionable, that governments across the world, the World Health Organization, Beyond Pesticide Organization, the Pesticide Action Network has deemed these pesticides not to be used because of their detrimental effects. Has the Parks Department seriously taken into consideration the use of the IPM policy, and when that policy is exhausted, would you consider using only organic products, not these synthetic pesticides that have questionable inert ingredients that have secret sauce priority ingredients that we don't know what is being used? Our local community here are very concerned that you're using these in our parks, and we're hoping you will look towards IPM and organic ways of controlling invasive species. Can you make a comment on that? Thank you.
Ray, do you want to talk about it from the national level, and then I'll talk about it locally?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, so National Park Service is, for many, many years now, has embraced integrated pest management practices. Like with many things, so our approach and direction on that evolves through time, as with many things. I would point out that it was here in the Santa Monica Mountains where research on sort of the discovery in some ways of anticoagulant rodenicides and the challenges that they're facing helped in part influence policies all around the country. And so I would say that the integrated pest management policies that the Park Service has in place includes very careful and stringent evaluation of what can be used and when it can be used and where it can be used. That is drawn from information on EPA and other sources. At the same time, we continue to monitor the use, which is also an obligation under integrated pest management, to ensure that the use of whatever techniques for controlling invasives or controlling other pests is done consistent with integrated pest management policies. There is a balance that we also consider around the challenges of invasives themselves and the damage that they do to ecosystems. And so that does factor into considerations of the techniques that are used to control invasives, because we see the damage that they create and the impacts that they create. Now, at the end of the day, it is the obligation and responsibility of the National Park Service to make sure that any technique that is used is not creating impacts that certainly outweigh the benefits of what is being done to help restore or control and restore an ecosystem or control an invasive species. It is a complicated question, and we're getting other issues, genetically modified organisms, all these other things are sort of coming into that. And so the integrated pest management effort is being looked at in that context, as it always is. So we're always sort of addressing these things. It's sort of an ongoing iterative process. But right now, any of those uses go through a process of approval that is based on the things that I mentioned. The last thing I think I'll touch on that is it's been a tough call, I think, in the Park Service about integrate. We tend to not like to think of pests, that it's all sort of wildlife or vegetation, and the challenge that gets thrown on top of that is when it's a non-native invasive. And the techniques and tools that we use in the Park Service, we attempt and try to make sure that they are as, sort of environmentally responsive as possible. But that is an issue that we continually discuss. Do you want to?
Sure. No, it's a really good question, and I think we're on a journey here in Southern California and probably heading in a more conservative direction than some of the rest of the country. So I think it helps to kind of see where we were and to see where we're going. I think, as Ray noted, 20 years ago there was a huge investment in I think there was a recognition that invasive plants were posing a huge economic cost to agriculture, huge ecological cost to the environment. And as a consequence, and the research at that time showed that a few of compounds could be used to control them without risk. I think if we look at our own track history, whenever we say without risk, we usually, as the research accumulates, the risk meter kind of starts going up. And I think we're seeing that right now. I won't weigh into, we're one federal government, so you're not going to hear me talk about or override whatever EPA's opinion is. But there are a number of governments and government agencies that are making different determinations right now about the risks posed by these chemicals than was the case 10 years ago. And I think it's responsible for us to look at that and see how we can change how we do things. I think, as Ray noted, in the past here, it is one of our policies to one, to not use herbicides unless we need to, and to use them in extremely small doses. So I was looking at data from last year, and I think on one 10-acre plot we used 6 ounces of Roundup, which was spot applied. Right now we do have our invasive plant manager recruiting volunteers and looking at sort of other ways and alternative ways to do that. And we welcome your help, but it is something that's in motion. Like I said, we have a whole program for treating these things, and we're kind of going site by site. We looked at sites in Malibu first and asked ourselves, could we do it in a different way? And at Solstice Canyon, we had Hattery, and at Bonsall Drive, we had essentially had some places where we had restored. They had been invasive mustard. Now they're native chaparral, and essentially what we were doing was spot treatment. So the answer was yes. So here locally, we're going to continue to ask that question and go through all of the sites that we treat and try to do it a different way. But again, a lot of it's really respecting, even if we don't make a statement about risk, I think there's a lot to be said for just respecting local government decisions. And it's very difficult. We're on one side, when we're on one side or the other, it's really, really hard. The folks at Yellowstone, I think sometimes as far as where they are in wildlife management, may be in a different place than the community surrounding the park. And so I think to the degree possible, we do try to listen to what's happening. So I'm not going to come out and say, oh yes, we think this is awful, but I think the question, can we do it another way, and is it as effective, and can we sustain it and get the same results? We're going to see, and we're trying it in a few places, and so stay tuned.
And of course, I think the the fact that bark beetles weren't a big deal 20 years ago, and they are a big deal now, and that's linked to climate change. And one of our Kretz postdocs is working on the relationship between drought and increased nitrogen from pollutants and how that affects native and non-native species. And I mean, it's a really complicated landscape, and I don't envy you guys the having to make those balancing act decisions. Okay, I want one more question. Who's it going to be? Right?
People lobbying for questions.
Right, the woman on our left, I think. Sid, right there. Oh, behind you. Yep. Nope. There we go. Okay.
To end on what I hope is kind of a positive note, my friend and I here are two of the volunteers that have been working the Kids in the Parks program. We're entering into I think the 4th round. It's been Peter Strauss a couple of times in King Gillette Ranch to work with these kids. Some of them have been in the parks and been camping before, but most of the kids, this is the first time they've ever been outside. And at the end of the day, when they come up to us, the rangers and the volunteers, and say, this is the best field trip we have ever had, thank you so much. And you get on the bus to swear them as they all get sworn in as junior rangers, and we get on the bus to swear them in, and I always ask them, did you have a good time? The whole bus, yes. So that's just a thank you. This is the most amazing program, and these kids are in the parks. We have 300 kids a day every time we do it, and they do activities, and they go on a hike. This is most of the time, the first time they've ever hiked. We set up tents. Some of them have gone camping before with their families, but most of them, first time they've ever seen a tent. The looks on their faces and the joy is unbelievable. So thank you.
And I think we are over time by 15 minutes, but I know we could keep going, but I think we're not going to. So please join me in thanking Ray, thanking David. And thanking Lee Katz and Pepperdine University for helping us do this. It's the evening, people need to get home, so I think we should clear out. Thanks a million, everybody, for coming.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?